Welcome to the Safety Wire podcast. Before we get started with today's episode, I would like to take a moment and acknowledge the members of Delta Airlines Tech Ops Department that tragically lost their lives earlier this week, Marco Marwick and Luis Alvarado, and we are praying for the recovery of a third worker whose name has not yet been released. As always, we're going to let the investigation unfold and not make assumptions. However, this does highlight the dangers that are sometimes seen or unseen within our industry. We lift our prayers to the families, coworkers, and our industry overall that was affected during this tragedy. Welcome, everyone, to the Safety Wire podcast, where we look at aviation safety from the ground up. I'm Tim Wade, your host. My guest today is Niven Phoenix. Niven spent 16 years in the RAF flying C-130s and C-17s. Since his exit from the military, he has built an impressive resume throughout the aviation industry. However, today's episode will be focused more so on one event, how that day would shape Niven's life, and how he has used that experience to be an advocate for transparency and improving aviation safety in the years following. Niven, welcome. It is such an honor to have you here with me.
Tim, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. It's a real privilege, to be honest. I hope I do it justice.
Oh, I'm sure you will. It is great to have you on. It was wonderful meeting you just a few months ago while I was in London, and your story just resonated. I loved how you wanted to advocate so much for transparency within aviation safety, and I thought that would be a great segment to have on here. So tell me a little bit about yourself, what's your background in aviation, and what you're doing currently today.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So my background, grew up in Northern Ireland, in what was euphemistically called the Troubles. So that was a conflict really that raged for, well, nearly 30 years in Northern Ireland. My father was a Royal Ulster Constabulary Special Branch officer. He was a former paratrooper. So we grew up in what you would call under threat. So that is growing up with bulletproof glass, panic buttons in rooms, and cameras and doorbells. This is way before the Ring doorbell system was invented by Amazon. We had it in Northern Ireland. So it was an unusual way to grow up, although I also grew up in a very beautiful part of Northern Ireland, albeit in unusual circumstances, and certainly very unusual looking back now as an adult, to myself as a child growing up, knowing that there was somebody out there who ostensibly wanted to do you harm, cause harm to you and your family, and didn't care who got killed in the process. So that's an unusual way to grow up. That led me into the military. I probably was always going to go that way. I grew up in a house full of special forces, parachute regiment, even FBI officers. When I met some FBI officers who came out, there was very close relationships between RUC Special Branch and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So it was a really interesting time, and it made me want to join the military. So I joined the military as a pilot. I was in the Royal Air Force for, as you say, 16 years. And I started off on a tactical squadron, 47 Squadron at RAF Lynham, and that was flying tactical transport. So all the things I'm sure you got engaged in as well, Tim, getting picked up by some smelly old Herc with 4 old turbo engines blasting away on strips and deserts, and all good fun MVG stuff. I was one of the Halo crews and also worked with the RAF parachute display team. So that was all good fun. Nice intro to flying. I then moved on to the C-130J, which is sometimes called the Super Hercules. It performed better on 3 engines than the old Herc did on 4, so that was a fantastic thing to fly. And that was 2 glass cockpit, and again, really interesting experience working a lot in Afghanistan and Iraq, where I was a captain doing detachments, moving troops and people around. Then moved on to C-17s. I was taught very early on by an instructor. And it was interesting, actually. He wasn't even an instructor I liked very much, Tim, but you can learn as much from people you don't like as people you do like. And I remember him telling me it's very important to always move up an aircraft. So you never go back down and follow the technology. So I went to C-17s and I got trained by the United States Air Force in Altus, Oklahoma, and spent 3 months out there. That was good fun. That was really interesting, where I was introduced to the concept of a sissy burger. Don't know if you heard about that, Tim, but that's where if you ask for ketchup, if you ask for tomato sauce or ketchup on your burger, they don't like that in Oklahoma. That was called a sissy burger. So we could only have mustard on our burgers in Oklahoma. So there you go. Travel tip if you go to Oklahoma.
Oh, for
So
goodness sakes! No, we're gonna stop you there and probably exile Oklahoma over their choices of burgers because no, I'm in Ohio and we do ketchup. However, I will tell you if you drive just west of where
yeah,
I'm at in Ohio, you'll hit Chicago. They have
right.
the same rules surrounding hot dogs. It's kind of weird. You can only put mustard on a hot dog or mustard and onion. Can't put ketchup. But we just ignore them from time to time with their
Okay.
choices on things.
To be fair, I know I quite like mustard, so so it didn't do me any harm. Um, and that led into being a captain on C-17s, operating primarily to Afghanistan because that was probably one of our longest conflicts. And I'm sure you and I probably crossed paths out there, Tim, if not there
Hmm.
or in Iraq. Um, that was a much more emotive, um, I would say, what you call it, detachment or detachments. So even though you weren't spending the same amount of time in country in Afghanistan because it was too expensive an asset to leave in theatre, certainly for the Royal Air Force, we were going there an awful lot for prolonged periods, and we were taking in the young troops, and we were also bringing them back out in various states of disarray. So we did a lot of the casualty evacuations.
Hmm.
We did a lot of the repatriations of bringing the bodies back, and that was quite emotive tasking. And that certainly had a very strong impact upon me and everybody who did it. You cannot help but be moved when you see, another human being in such a fragile, vulnerable state, missing arms and legs and injured in horrific ways. Um, and I think it was very interesting in terms of the medical advances which took place that time.
Hmm.
So we worked a lot with the tactical medical wing, who I'm sure you came into contact with, and I remember how they kept people alive, and it was fantastic to see. It was very humbling, but it was also, I would say, very affecting. That led me into doing something called TRIM, which is trauma and risk management, and that happened after one particular incident where I had done a massive casualty evacuation, and we had multiple casualties in the back. And there were very long days, Tim. There were 24-hour crew duty days, things which wouldn't
Hmm.
be allowed in civil aviation. But it's like the military, you just kind of got on and did things. And I think that actually probably made it more testing and more stressful because when you're tired, you're much more emotionally, I suppose, vulnerable and reactive. And I remember coming back
Exactly.
after a particularly long um, casualty evacuation, and we had some very badly injured people in the back, people who were so badly injured that I actually struggled to look at them. And then I
Hmm.
felt bad and felt guilty. And I felt, no, I do have to look at them, and if they have to bear it, then I have to look. So, and I always made the point of going down and chatting and being with the people and speaking certainly with the escorts as well, who were, again, just very often young, traumatized troop commanders who were accompanying back their men. And I remember coming back feeling very affected, and I was asked some trivial thing by a flight commander, Niven, have you done your basic training requirements? And I remember thinking, do you not know what I've been through? And I remember
Hmm.
feeling that bloom of anger, and my Irish temper came up, and
Hmm.
I could feel my fists curl. I thought, okay, this isn't good. And after that, I went and spoke to flight commander, and I said, look, I've merely punched out one of the nicest flight commanders that we have. So I said, so that's nothing to do with poor old Frank. That's poor old me. And I said, and I probably considered myself quite resilient, Tim, due to
Hmm.
the things which we'll come on to talk about later on in the program. Things I dealt with in Northern Ireland and losing friends and family, in the troubles. And I thought, well, if it's affecting me, and I was relatively old, how is it affecting everybody else? And that's when we decided to then look at what we were doing. Could we do it differently? And we brought in TRIM, trauma and risk management, which I became a trainer. And it's basically giving people coping skills, improving emotional vocabulary, because as men, we're not very good at talking about those things. And I think there is
Exactly.
that. It's like you were in a uniform. People in uniform don't cry. They don't talk about their feelings. They just get on. And a coping strategy was probably a couple of beers at the end of the night. But ultimately, we probably needed to do it a bit better, and we did. We rolled out a training program, and we basically educated people as to how they would feel these things, why they would feel things, the body's physiological effects to stress, how trauma affects you, and that was a very successful program. And it eventually rolled out across the station, and I got given an award for it in conjunction. I think it was the 2010. I can't remember which year it was, but I given an award in conjunction with the Queen's Birthday Honours List, what was called an AOC two groups commendation for the work that we
Wow.
did. So that was really good. That brought me into the world of peer support and trauma management and also mental health first aid. So those are things I then explored at a later stage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it was probably due to the traumas that I had suffered as a young man when I was 21 when I lost my father, because I was probably kidding myself that I felt I dealt with
Mm-hmm.
that quite well. And it wasn't until I was dealing with other traumas in Afghanistan and Iraq that I realized I probably hadn't dealt with it that well. So it was an educational process for me, and I sort of took the opportunity to hopefully educate other people. And we concentrated a lot on, say, vulnerable groupings. So younger engineers, people who we knew would be affected by what they were seeing, and we targeted them in the training of that trauma and risk management. And that still goes on. I mean, it's a very good program. It's invented by the Royal Marines, but like a lot of these things in the military, it was siloed. So they were doing it
Mm-hmm.
very, really well over there, but we hadn't heard of it and weren't doing it. Certainly not in 99 Squadron. Primarily, probably because we weren't in theatre. Lots of probably
Mm-hmm.
thought we didn't need it. Flash aircrew living in hotels. Why did but in terms of exposure to it, you don't have to be injured to be affected by an injury. You just have to witness it, and we call that vicarious trauma or secondary victimhood. So
Mm-hmm.
that was a very interesting time. So hopefully that sort of gives you a background of my military aspect
Yeah.
and
Thank you
what I
so
was
much
doing in
for
the
that.
military. Yeah,
Yeah, and they actually say, with PTSD and trauma that not all wounds are visible, and you're absolutely right that trauma is obviously invisible and it's difficult to deal with. And you made a great point that it's an educational process to sustain trauma and to process through it. It takes a lot because you're not used to it. It's an unknown at that time. And we had kind of an unwritten rule when we were in Afghanistan that the evac is your closure.
yeah,
When the casualties are evacuated away, or you are, that's your closure, and then you just go on with your next day. And you're exactly right that that's not how you're supposed to process it, and that leads to a lot of issues down the line for sure. And that's why I think the mental health crisis among the veterans right now globally after Afghanistan and Iraq is one of the biggest issues we have right now facing veterans,
yeah, definitely.
alongside all the burn pits and the nastiness going on with that. So,
Yeah.
you had
Well,
yeah, you mentioned your father. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
so I was going to say, just an interesting statistic on service personnel. I don't know what it is for the Americans, but for UK forces, the average length of time it takes for somebody to go and actually seek support around trauma is about 14 years.
Word. Yeah.
So and that seems crazy, but when I look back upon it, so I lost my father when I was 21 in a relatively traumatic accident, certainly traumatic for the people who are in it, and definitely
Mm-hmm.
traumatic for the families. And I didn't take any support for well over a decade. Well
Mm-hmm.
over a decade. I didn't seek support. I just didn't think that was what you did, you know? So that statistic I would say is probably quite accurate.
Yeah, that grief process takes so long. Acceptance, understanding you have an issue. It takes a
Yeah.
lot of vulnerability just to say that this did affect me, and then even more vulnerability to say I need some help with this issue. You've
Yeah.
mentioned your father a few times. Can you tell us a little bit about him? What he was a police officer in Northern Ireland, and
Yeah. So my father was a very interesting character. He grew up one of nine kids, pretty much, in a two-bedroom cottage back in County Tyrone in Northern Ireland. So a very
mm,
rural upbringing. And there's two methods of escape, really, from that type of, I suppose you would call it, relatively poor background. You either took an educational route or you probably went and joined the army. So my father joined the army as a paratrooper. He fought in Borneo and Rad Fan. So at the same time as the Americans were fighting in Vietnam, he was fighting in Borneo. And in fact, he used to come into contact with the Americans on their R&R in Singapore. I think they had various punch-ups in various bars between the Brits and the Yanks when they were both in their R&R from what were quite sort of messy conflicts at the time.
mm-hmm.
He then left the parachute regiment and joined the RUC, the police force in Northern Ireland, in 1969, and that is exactly when the Troubles kicked off in Northern Ireland, and when we had the emergence of what we called the PIRA, which would be the Provisional IRA, who then went on to launch and become one of the most, I suppose, effective terrorist organizations in Western Europe, and certainly sustained a program of violence for decades in Northern Ireland. And that led to mushrooming of various other organizations, terrorist organizations, the Irish National Liberation Army, and then there were the loyalist organizations as well, who were equally destructive and equally non-discriminatory in who they would attack, and that would be organizations like the Ulster Defence Association, or sorry, the UDA, Ulster Defence Association, or UVF, the Red Hand Commandos. Northern Ireland is awash and was awash of these when I was growing up.
Hmm.
So he lived and worked combating people who would attack people and property. And he, because of his background in the military, he rose quite rapidly and became a detective superintendent in IUC Special Branch, and that would be in charge of technical intelligence. So that would be things like bugging of weapons, so you can tell when weapons hides have been moved or interfered with. Um, they would be doing the phone intercepts
Hmm.
and bugging people's houses, that type of thing. And it was very successful. Um, I would say one of the main reasons why the peace process eventually had to happen was because Pyro were militarily defeated in all but a few small pockets of Northern Ireland. They couldn't really launch operations because they were penetrated so heavily by human intelligence and also by technical intelligence by people like my father and his teams. Um, and I say he's been mentioned in quite a few books. I know I mentioned that
Hmm.
to you, Tim, before. So,
Yeah.
and in fact, he's in a book which we've turned into an audiobook, which is Phoenix Policing the Shadows. And that was written by my mother and by the late Jack Holland, who was a very interesting character himself. So while my father was, I would say, a poor Protestant growing up in Northern Ireland, Jack was a poor Catholic growing up in Northern Ireland, and he took the educational route. And he became a journalist and actually worked for the Irish Echo and was a journalist in New York for several years, and became friends with my mum and dad inadvertently when they hired their holiday apartment in Italy. Jack and Mary, his wife, had a lovely holiday apartment in Italy. My mum and dad hired it and then became friends. But what was
Hmm.
quite interesting was Jack was doing a book on a terrorist organization called the Irish National Liberation Army. So he was meeting lots of terrorists whilst writing this book. He didn't know my father was in the police, and the way we grew up in Northern Ireland, we didn't tell people. You
Hmm.
just you had a cover story, I suppose. He's a civil servant or he works in insurance. So something
Hmm.
vaguely along the lines of the truth, but not necessarily the truth, and you would just be deliberately vague about these things. So Jack didn't know my father was actually a very high-ranking IEC officer until the day of my father's death, which was the 2nd of June, 1994, where he was killed when a Mark II Chinook flew into the side of the Mullican Tower, killing 29 people on board, which was all the occupants, the 4 crew, and also basically the cream of counterintelligence in Northern Ireland. That would include IC Special Branch, military intelligence, and also some of the security services as well. So we had members of the security services on board. So quite a traumatic crash in June '94. And that is when Jack realised, oh my goodness, that's our Ian. And then there's this whole story behind how he and my mum got together and they wrote a book, which is ostensibly a medal from my father that my mum wanted to
Hmm.
write. So it's been very successful. It's sold over 100,000 copies, and it also has now gone on to detail elements of the crash itself, which has kind of become one of the more controversial crashes in British military history.
Well, first off, congratulations to your mom and the team that put the book together. That's outstanding. It's very commendable. And my sympathies to you over the years for your father's life. Thank you for his service and yours as well, and what he did and how he laid down his life and sacrificed for his country is extremely commendable. Tell me about June 2nd. You mentioned it briefly, but what led to the accident? Why did this take place? And then if you want to get into a little bit of the controversy surrounding that, I'd love to hear about that as well.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. So everybody was being transported on the helicopter to a security conference in Fort George up in Inverness in Scotland. It's an annual conference, and this conference was basically going to be focused that year on how they're going to handle the loyalist paramilitaries because the peace process was in the offing. So how are they going to prevent the backlash?
Hmm.
And it was, I suppose, a regular thing. My father, to be fair, didn't really even want to go to the conference, which is one of the sad things. He was like, and somebody at last minute had said, "Oh, wanted to go in this place." He was like, "Oh, great." He was going to get out. At that time, he was a very mellow man. June's a lovely time of year to be in Northern Ireland or in Scotland. It's when the weather's at its best. So he was enjoying, just being off, going fishing and shooting and doing all the things that we'd like to do where we grew up in a very beautiful part of Northern Ireland. But unfortunately, he did get in a helicopter. The helicopter itself was a very new design. It was the Mark II Chinook. It had been rushed into service, and unbeknownst to not only the passengers but also the crew, there were a number of flaws in its design and its build. It was accepted what we would call off contract, Tim. So there's normally a scale of how an aircraft comes into production. So and not until the very end of that is it considered to be safe to be released to service. It was actually still in that period of being considered safe and being tested to see whether it was safe to be released to service. And that document, the RTS release to service, had effectively not been created by the RAF Testing and Evaluation Unit at Boscombe Down. They had found numerous faults with that aircraft, numerous software issues, of which a number they had described as positively dangerous. They had grounded the aircraft twice in the preceding weeks, and in fact, on the very day of the crash, the Testing and Evaluation Centre had again grounded that Mark II Chinook and said it was not safe to fly. That was withheld from the crews. The crews, you and I have talked about documentation and the importance of it,
Hmm.
and that it be relevant and up to date. The documentation they were given for their aircraft, if you go to one of the most, I suppose, important aspects of any aircraft documentation would be the limitations section. If you went to the limitations section of the Mark II Chinook that was given to the pilots, it just said to be issued. So that is incredible that they were flying an aircraft without
Hmm.
actually having access to the limitations of the aircraft.
Now, was
One of
this
those.
just the RAF testing it at the time, or was this had Boeing said that we're not going through with production?
So the aircraft had been produced, but it was in the testing and evaluation stage. And in terms of how we fly it in the Royal Air Force, maybe slightly different to aspects of how things are flown in USAF. So I know from chatting to other people on procurement teams that the lightning aspect for one of the latest fighters, I think it was the F-35, the
Hmm.
Americans weren't too bothered about it, because they would have hundreds of them. Whereas we would only have 35 of them. We'd have like a
Hmm.
handful. So it had to be fully tested because, we couldn't afford to lose any due to lightning. So there are probably different requirements by
Got
different
it.
organizations, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
the icing clearance, certainly there was no icing clearance for that helicopter. Now to have an icing clearance on a helicopter in Europe is, absolutely essential, absolutely
Yeah.
essential. But on that day, they would have had no icing clearance, so that would have limited what they could do with that helicopter and where they could fly it on the day. So those types of things that the RAF testing evaluation would have been coming up with. Now they said they couldn't produce a release of service, but if they did produce one, it would look substantially like this, and they produced what an interim one would look like. And the RAF, in their haste to push into service, took that document, had somebody sign it, and pushed the aircraft into service, which I can understand because there are operational imperatives.
Hmm.
Having said that, there were some known issues with the aircraft which were not transmitted to the crews. The navigation and communication systems had what we would call switch on clearance only. So
Hmm.
in the release of service, it would say they were not to be relied upon in any way whatsoever. So basically, that means you could turn it on the ground, Tim, but you couldn't fly it. So it was effectively more like a ground training instrument. I mean, it certainly wasn't what we would call airworthy. And
Very expensive simulator, right?
it was a very expensive simulator. And interesting, the pilots knew it. They had both upped their life insurance in the weeks and months prior to this. One of them
Word.
had spoken to his father. His father, John Cook, was a former Concorde pilot, quite a well-known pilot in military circles. Tim, he helped bring in black box recorders after some of the crashes that we had in England and made sure they were mandatory on UK civil aircraft. So a very professional pilot himself, and the two pilots themselves were special forces crew. In fact, the whole crew was a special forces crew. So they were not ordinary pilots. They were very
Mm-hmm.
dedicated, highly trained, and they had asked for a Mark One Chinook on the day. They did not want to fly the aircraft. They didn't want to fly the aircraft full stop, and they certainly didn't want to put high value passengers on board the aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and the outcome was, an accident which traumatized the military establishment. This was the biggest loss of life in the history of the Air Force, I'd say, since World War II. Um, and it led to a very knee-jerk reaction of we must get a cause out immediately. So they ran a board of inquiry. The board of inquiry, I would say, was not fit for purpose. And back in those days, Tim, it was very much you could be a junior pilot on the squadron. Somebody said there was a board of inquiry. Can you come and help out? And you just got put
Mm-hmm.
onto it. So they wouldn't necessarily have the training and the wherewithal to deal with what was actually a probably systemic failing. And what they did was they took the path of least resistance. And of course, the easiest thing to do in any accident in any industry is blame the people who were at the controls at the time, which
Mm-hmm.
is what they did. And they crucified those career pilots. They blamed them, accused them of gross negligence, which you cannot do if there's any doubt. And so they basically said they deliberately flew that aircraft into the Mull of Qatar, which is a ridiculous assertion. And
Yes.
it took 17 years to clear the pilots' names. And as a family, we fully supported the pilots. It was very evident that this was not a coherent investigation. It was very evident that this was a very convenient way to deal with an accident. In the Board of Inquiry itself, they don't mention airworthiness once, not once in the Board of Inquiry. In subsequent fatal accident inquiries, it does get mentioned, but all of this is predicated on the fact that they felt the aircraft was fit for purpose and was airworthy. And actually, we now know, unfortunately, this was the first in a long line of military accidents in the Royal Air Force, which culminated. I don't know if you remember, Tim, but there was a Nimrod aircraft flew up over Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was 2006. I can't quite remember, so apologies to the families if I've got that wrong. Um, and that then led to a report by a Queen's Counsel. So they brought
Mm-hmm.
in a high eminent solicitor, a man called Charles Haddon Cave, and he wrote a 500 odd page report on the Royal Air Force, which was blistering in its attitude towards the Air Force and their lack of ability to manage airworthiness, and basically accused them of a failure of the military covenant, that they had not really done all the good things which you and I take for granted. When you go to fly and operate aircraft, you expect somebody to have made sure everything that's come before it is, legal, for want of a better word, and that it is safe to operate. And that
Mm-hmm.
did not happen in a whole host of accidents in the Royal Air Force. And the very first one was the Chinook. And had they investigated it, Tim, and done a good job at the time, they probably could have prevented a loss of numerous accidents afterwards, including one which killed my mates on a C-130, which was shot down over Iraq, and that was XV-179. That was killed by one. That aircraft, again, I think killed 14 people, and friends and colleagues of mine who I flew with, because I was
Mm-hmm.
flying C-130s at the time. And that was brought down by one bullet, one high explosive round, which would not have brought down any other C-130 operated by a Western force. It wouldn't have brought down an American C-130 nor an Australian C-130, because they had suppressant foam in the tanks to prevent that fuel air explosion. Now, the Royal Air Force, again, despite calls from the troops to say, and the calls went back to 1982 to the Falklands conflict,
Mm-hmm.
saying, can we get the same protections as our American colleagues? Can we have the suppressant foam in the tanks? And every time a accountant or somebody in Whitehall said no, why would we need that? Well, we would have needed it to prevent what happened to the XV-179. Again, another airworthiness issue. They didn't have the suppressant foam tanks. They had a high explosive round, blew off the wing, and killed all of those guys. And
Mm-hmm.
all of these are all airworthiness issues, Tim.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so hopefully that gives a bit of background to the sort of the Chinook crash and why it's been so controversial. But any other
Yeah,
items?
absolutely. we aviation is where we are today, unfortunately, because of how many people we have killed over the past
Yeah,
100 years. It's a lot of
absolutely.
blood priority. But living now, 2024, you would think at some point it would stop. How many more accidents do we need to have before we just start using some common sense with airworthiness and common sense with a lot of the regulatory things that we're piecing together? I mean, for goodness sakes, it takes 15, 20 years to get a simple thing such as safety management systems online
Yeah.
and proper risk management. And it just seems like we're stretching it out for no reason at the cost of so many lives. And that's where it does get frustrating. So, where do we stand today with this investigation? You've done a ton of work on this. You've been to the accident site multiple times. You're working with the families. You're rallying the troops, so to speak, to get this across the board. So, where are we at today with this, and why is it so controversial?
Well, that's a good question, because it's 30 years. This is 30 years.
Yeah.
And we are still looking at this accident and still asking questions and still finding things out, which is really interesting. So last year I was involved with a production team out of Northern Ireland called Fine Point Films, and they produced an excellent documentary called Chinook, Zulu Delta 576. So that is a two-part BBC documentary,
Mm-hmm.
which basically it scratches the surface of what happened, but it does show the elements of what I would call omission and commission. So you and I, we live in the real world. We know that people make mistakes and get things wrong and leave things out, and we would maybe call those things, errors of omission. But
Mm-hmm.
what is interesting in the Chinook crash is the errors of commission, where people know something is wrong and then they go out of their way to conceal it. So that has come up. And I think this is probably most evidenced by the fact that they sealed the records around that crash for 100 years. That is unprecedented. So if we go back and look at, say, something of comparable secrecy involving, I know, security services or war, like World War II, SOE files, the Special Operations Executive files, they get sealed for maybe 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
You don't seal things beyond 50 years unless there's something in there that you really don't want people to see. And they seal these for 100 years. So when we made the documentary, that came out. And what was interesting was a lot of the military families. So I was 21 at the time of the crash, but some of the children from the Chinook were not even born. Three were not born.
Mm-hmm.
And they watched this documentary, having heard maybe that their fathers had been killed in an accident that was the pilot's fault, and not really being of an age to have delved into it and just, grown up accepting it. And suddenly they realized, hang on a minute, this doesn't sound right. And they had
Mm-hmm.
the Secretary of State for Defence at the time, Sir Malcolm Rifkind, talking about how he was lied to by the Ministry of Defence, and how the Ministry of Defence, the RAF, were marking their own homework, in effect, with this accident, and asking questions as to why they would do that. So they have galvanized, and these so children of the Chinook, I would call them, have actually instigated a legal team. And so there's a legal team who are the same legal team who represented some very high profile cases within the UK. The Hillsborough disaster, which was a massive football crush, where again there were
Mm-hmm.
systemic failings and elements of cover up by the establishment in just wrongdoing. They also represented families of the sub postmasters. There was a massive scandal recently in the UK where about 600 sub postmasters who ran post offices were jailed for computer faults, which they pinned on the people working at the computers, and actually there were faults within the computer. So people went to jail, for no reason at all, and it caused a massive scandal, Tim. And
Oh
they
goodness.
represented those people as well. So we now have a legal team, and I think they will be calling for a public inquiry in time, to try and find out what is in these files. What is
Mm-hmm.
it they really don't want people to see? Why is there this need for this lack of transparency? Surely, if there's been an accident, you want to find out why to prevent reoccurrence, and who is benefiting from sealing these files. So that is probably the next iteration of this accident. So we will see something coming to fruition, I hope, in the next 12 months. We've got a new government in the UK. Hopefully, they will want to any mistakes as per the sub postmasters or the Hillsborough. They'll want to be seen to have clean hands, and I'd like to think we'll probably start to get some answers as to why they allowed this aircraft to be pushed into service, who made those decisions, and why they made some of the decisions to conceal evidence from inquiries and fatal accident inquiries after the crash.
Outstanding. We will definitely be watching closely as you progress through the legal turmoil and all that to get this to fruition. It's extremely commendable how focused you are on this. I've seen so many articles, the audiobook, all the ebooks that are out right now detailing this, and it is crazy to think it's 30 years in the making. And if you search for this, most of the things representing this accident are fresh within just the past few years. You see a ton of momentum behind this. So I hope that momentum continues for you guys and you're able to get this across the finish line, at least get some answers out there. I want to bring this back to safety a little bit for us. How does that event, and you work with multiple agencies for risk management and discussing safety and making aviation better. How does this event for you influence risk management in aviation? How has it been utilized to improve risk management and safety in aviation?
Well, it certainly took me into risk management in terms of human factors. So, as you know, I have a real interest in human factors. I
Mm-hmm.
was a human factors trainer within the Royal Air Force. Post Haddon K, post that report into Nimrod crash, the Air Force were found to be unfit to regulate their own safety. So that led to the creation of the MAA, the Military Aviation Authority. Before that, we had the CAA, the Civil Aviation Authority, which is your equivalent to the FAA, but there was
Mm-hmm.
really nobody regulating military flying. They were deemed to be fit to regulate themselves, and unfortunately, that wasn't the case. So the MAA led to a safety partner being appointed to basically teach the Air Force how to exercise common sense sometimes. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and how to stop using secrecy to prevent safety, which I
Mm-hmm.
think was happening quite a bit. And I worked with that company, that safety consultancy, and they trained myself up to be one of the human factors trainers so that actually we could educate people across a broad swathe of the organization. Because I think sometimes safety management and risk management, it's understood by a small cabal of people, but it is not understood across the whole organization.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things my dad was a very effective leader. Um, you know, he was a natural leader, and one of his, I suppose, mantras was information needs to be kept broad and across all the ranks. So everyone needs to know their small part of what they're doing and how that contributes to the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was involved in and engaged in as a human factors trainer. So I was training up, parachute jump instructors, engineers, anyone really. So we all had a better understanding of human factors and how things that we do as humans um, can either cause or prevent accidents. So we can find ourselves in error-prone situations, or we can recognize when we are in an error-prone situation, and then we can do the avoid, trap, mitigate, and all the good stuff that we would recognize from safety management. So that was basically where it led me to go because I wanted to follow that path.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I subsequently helped set up a company doing human factors training, and you've been involved with some of the people in that company.
Yep.
That's sort of gone through various mutations, and it is now run by a very good friend of mine, two good friends of mine, Simon and Ross, and they're still doing that work. And Simon and I, we had some really interesting experiences together in the military where we were trained up. So we understood the human factors elements of a situation. But you're in a situation where the people who are working hard on the ground really don't know the risk that they are creating. And I
Mm-hmm.
think one classic would be in Afghanistan on a C-17 flying into Bastion. And you remember the C-17, fantastic aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
You could flip the floor from roller to flat floor and change the loading characteristics within minutes. It was brilliant aircraft. I think it's probably the best designed aircraft I've ever flown for its purpose. Now the Americans and the Brits would come in side by side, and you'd see the Americans, and they would bring up a low loader, and 14 pallets would go straight off, and then 14 pallets would go straight on, and then the aircraft would get airborne. It'd be 30 minutes. Now Not quite the same with the Brits, who I don't know if you remember, Tim, they used to call us the Flintstones. It's like, here come the Flintstones with their almost suitable equipment. We had a forklift truck which worked in bunny hops. So we work in 1 foot bunny hops, right? Okay, I think we've got one more bunny hop and we offload one pallet at a time. And oh, it was just, we didn't have weigh bridges for weighing the equipment. And we didn't have enough people. So we had tired loaders. And this culminated one night where a truck was loaded on the back of our aircraft, and this we'd been there for hours, literally hours. About three American C-17s had been and gone, and we were still there trying to get a load on. And they changed the floor over, and they're trying to get vehicles on. And at about 4 hours in, a young corporal, female corporal, came up to us and she said, "My boss has just fudged the figures and the chains for that truck because everyone had a tie-down scheme that was based on the weight of the axle of the truck in the back of the aircraft. So you didn't have this runaway load situation where you
Yeah.
could have a truck loose in the back, which you and I know to our horrors caused some horrific accidents, including the one out of I think it was Bagram, wasn't it? That
Yeah.
747
Bagram,
that got
yeah.
yeah, that was a runaway load. So we had a situation where a young mover was having to report to us that her boss had fudged the figures because he was just tired. Tim, he was trying to,
Hmm.
he'd been trying for 3 hours to get a load on. And we looked at the paperwork, and yeah, he Tipex. Did he have Tipex in the States? That white stuff. He
Oh,
basically,
white out. Yeah.
yeah. So he'd
Uh-huh.
white out over the figures. Instead of putting on a 200-pound tie-down chain, he'd use 100-pound tie-down chains. And he thought, "Oh, I'm just going to get this out." So of course she showed us this, and we thought, well, we can't take the truck. So we basically call a halt, bring him over. Have you done this? Of course he's like, yeah, yeah. And he admitted it, and we
Hmm.
explained, well, if we hit turbulence and that truck comes loose, mate, this is going to be really dangerous. So we're going to have to stop now, which is take a breath, and we're going to deal with this. And we filed this huge report. And this was just after we'd had all the safety training. And this guy thought he was going to lose his job, Tim. He's obviously
Hmm.
distraught, and he'd have to be pulled up by one of his junior members of his team. But actually, that was a really good example of how we could do things right, because what we did was the report was taken seriously. We looked at the mitigating circumstances. They'd all been on nights for 3 months. They're all absolutely
Hmm.
shattered with fatigue. They were not making sensible decisions. They did not have the right resources. They were effectively being set up to fail. They didn't have the right loading kit. They didn't have the right weigh bridges. And our report, written by Simon and myself, who are both human factors training instructors, ensured that they got the right weigh bridge. They got a change in shift patterns. So they rotated people from days to nights properly, and they did things correctly. So I think that was probably a good example of how we use that information to the greater good, not to penalise and assign blame and
Hmm.
have that guy hoiked out, but actually support him to do his job correctly, because he basically had been set up to fail. He had not been set up for success.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's where we want to be in terms of human factors, and that's the type of, it was working well when I left the military. It was all going the right direction. I don't know if it is now, but it's certainly how we left it. It was an improving situation.
I left in 2013. It was going okay. Yeah, I think too many people go into an incident investigation, and we discuss this in our human factors training with you guys as well. Blame is a delicious word. People
Yeah,
people try to go into it thinking that the person that caused it had malice intent, and when you really break down the human factors, 99% of the time you are going to see that they're working extreme hours. They're working a different shift. They're just trying to get it done. They're not being supported the proper way. We've had tons of those in my history with maintenance where
yeah,
people make, unfortunately, a dumb decision. But when you break it away from that, you realize, oh man, that technician was on his 15th hour of work. He made the decision during shift change, had no support. That's a breakdown of a ton of different things. And when you do penalize the person who made that mistake, you just lost one of your people. That's all you
yeah,
did. You did not fix the problem. Because most likely, at least in my organization, if you were in a leadership position, you were probably on the floor at some point in your career. You worked your way up from maintenance to the top. We all did dumb stuff. We all have made mistakes. And when you do correct it one on one with the person, you've just improved that technician. You've improved that person to do better moving forward.
yeah.
but when you just fire them, you don't fix anything. It doesn't solve anything. So that's outstanding. You guys were able to kind of bring that one full circle and help out. I don't recall ever calling you guys the Flintstones, by the way. Um, I fortunately I was
Somebody
on
did.
I was at Kandahar, and so we were an international base. We had
Okay.
everybody. We were hangared with the Australians right next door, I think, to the Brits, and I think a couple hangars down we had the Germans. So
Okay.
it was an international party every single day. But yeah, and we kind of shared resources. We learned a lot of new lingo. The
Yeah.
Aussies have different words for everything. I couldn't understand what they were saying the first 2 months I was in country.
That's
But
standard. I still don't understand Aussies either. But yeah, I remember
yeah,
they had a great call sign, didn't they? Well, they were called Mambo. That was their call sign, wasn't it?
I think so.
Mambo.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The one guy
Yeah.
kept. It was like my first week there. He came up and said, "Can we borrow your goes under?" And I'm like, "Goes under." I'm like, "What?" And he kept saying it and saying it and saying, and they meant we call it a creeper in
Uh-huh.
in the U.S. And it's the little rolling platform you lay on so you can crawl under the
Go
aircraft. He
under.
goes, "Well, it goes under the aircraft. It's a goes under." I'm like, your guys' slang makes perfect sense when it's explained.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I thought what was quite interesting, the Australians, their C, because I was in Kandahar as well, and their
Mm-hmm.
C-130 det had 125 engineers. I think for maybe one C-130J, we had about three aircraft out there, and I think we had about 15 engineers.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the difference. They were again, they were well resourced. Yeah, they had. Yeah, but I'm surprised they didn't have their own goes under. But there you go. They certainly had plenty of people. Yeah, I mean, and it's great that cross pollination, isn't it? In terms of working with those different
Mm-hmm.
people and the safety things that you learn from them. One of the things you mentioned there, we all have done dumb things. One of the things that we used to brief, and going forward now, I still work as a civil pilot, and I use, what's dumb, different, or dangerous today, and that's something I picked up from an American USAF exchange pilot. He said, "Okay,
Mm-hmm.
what's dumb, different, dangerous today? What's going to kill us today? What are the threats?" And we very much use that threat-based briefing these days. Um, and sometimes, you're the person who's going to be dangerous. Sometimes it is going to be recognizing the fact, you're talking about that young engineer at the end of a 15-hour duty. Well, that could be you. That could be
Yep.
any of us. And that's where we say, right, we're both tired today. We brief these things still in the flight deck. How are we going to mitigate that? Right, let's slow everything down. Let's use some, alertness strategies, which I know we spoke about before in human factors training. We're going to do increased verbalization. We're going to give ourselves extra chance of picking up those mistakes. So I think it changes the way you look at safety. And I think if you've been, and I think this is the advantage, not saying military people are better, but I think it gives us that experience because we've seen so many things go wrong. So you know bad things can happen, and I think there's an element of, I suppose, more realism to what we
Mm-hmm.
do and why we do things. And I certainly think if you've lost people and lost friends due to accidents, and me, having lost my father, it just takes on a bigger dimension, the whole safety case,
Yeah.
because what the potential is, and you're always looking for those holes in the cheese.
Mm-hmm.
I meet sometimes some of the young civil pilots and trying to ingrain in them. Everyone thinks flying's safe. They go, "Oh, it's safest form of travel," and it is, but only because we make it so.
Yep.
And it's only as safe as you make it. And
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes people lose track of that, and not just the people you're working with, but people who manage you. Um, I don't know. I think you've got a fantastic organization. You've got people who you say work their way up from the shop floor, and I think they all get it. But what I'm seeing in civil aviation is we're bringing in managers with no aviation experience, and if they don't have the human factors understanding, and if they're just working under the misapprehension that flying is intrinsically safe because it's just safe, rather than how they're rolling it, I think that can cause that complacency, which we've seen in a lot of organizations. I think we've even seen it in Boeing lately, haven't we?
Yeah.
That's just complacency, and that's
Aviation is
all that
getting
is.
way too comfortable because
Yeah,
we're used to this great stretch we've had, and I pray to God that it continues and continues and continues. But
definitely. Yeah,
unfortunately, the new generation needs to realize the realism of what we do every single day, and it is not just by the grace of the industry that we're in, that we're intrinsically safe.
Yeah,
It was built on the backs and the bloodshed of people over the past 100 years who truly crafted it to be safe. And we're losing a lot of that generation who truly had skin in the game years ago. And now, unfortunately, the green generation coming through, they have not had that,
yeah.
that event that sticks out in their head of why they're doing things the way they're doing them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing it quite a lot. We used to work with an organization where we were effectively prepping young pilots. So we gave them a kind of, I suppose, a finishing school,
Mm-hmm.
because they go through and, you do your ATPL and your CPL and your PPL, and 18 months later, you pop out, oh, I'm a pilot. It's like there's a whole other aspect to flying and the management of safety and letting them know what their role was within a safety management
Mm-hmm.
system. The importance of reporting and why we report, and the fact we've got to put our hands up if we've got it wrong, and also not eroding your own safety standards, because I think
Yeah.
there is this push, this operational imperative. And if you're a young person or anyone these days and you've got a job, you feel kind of lucky. You've got a job. It's difficult times out there.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody asks you to go a wee bit beyond, your limitations or your regulations, you might think, well, yeah, I'll do that to help them out. But you're not really helping them out. You're just that's not risk management, that's risk transference. They've just transferred some risk to you and you've decided to take it. And I think trying to get some of the guys to understand the difference between risk management and risk transference is
Mm-hmm.
quite an interesting exercise to do in any sort of safety case. You know, and even talking about safety, for me, safety is so real because I've stood on that crash site. I've smelt the burnt heather and
Mm-hmm.
I've seen the wreckage. So it is so evident what I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to prevent. But it's not the case for everybody within this industry.
No, and that's truly unfortunate.
Yeah,
Well, I think you and I could talk for hours, if not weeks, and we have. And before
we've done quite
we
well,
have,
haven't we?
yes. We could definitely pull this conversation for hours and hours and hours, and I love that you have given your time to be here with us today. So thank you so much, Niven. We're gonna go ahead and wrap this up today. I think a part two would actually work as well. Colin did 2 episodes, and maybe
Well,
you and I do
Colin
three
did
just to
too.
trump him. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've got to up the Irish intake here as well. We can't let
There
people
we
just
go. We
get
need to
into
be
the exactly,
culturally diverse here. I think
exactly.
another episode on what you said, risk management versus risk transference. I think that would be extremely impactful, especially as we get up into a lot of the U.S. events that are going on here soon with safety stand downs that we have going on throughout October and November. But once again, thank you so much for being on today. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Absolutely, Tim. Thanks very much. And if I could just plug my mother's book as well, is that
I would love you
acceptable?
to. I'm going to link it
Well,
in the description as well.
well, that is the new cover that we've just had produced. So we've re-released it for the
It is
30-year
beautiful.
anniversary, and we've also got it on Spotify and on Audible, where it is actually myself and also my mother reads part of it as well. So, and that was quite an emotive thing, just reading that book again after 30 years.
Yeah.
So please do go and have a listen to it if the guys are on Spotify. It's Phoenix Policing the Shadows, and we'd love them to let us know what they think about it and leave some reviews as well. That'd be great.
Oh, wonderful. Absolutely. Yes. I will make sure I'll link that in the description. Printed copies, is that on Amazon or?
Yeah, printed copies are on Amazon,
Wonderful.
and yeah, but I think most people are using audiobooks these days. So that means you can you
I
can
like
do the
to write in
gardener.
my books. I do printed. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, all of my books are printed. So I'm an old soul like that, I guess.
Very good. Well, there you go. It's difficult to do it when quite often I'm in the car going to up to the airport, so I like to listen to them in the car. So I'm always listening to audiobooks these days. Means I can do
Wonderful.
two things at once. Lovely,
Sure.
Tim.
Yeah,
Thanks
I'll
very
link it out.
much. Cool.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
sir. All
All right,
right.
Tim.
Take
Thanks
care.
very much. All the
Take care,
best.
everybody.